Hi, welcome to my weekly live stream. Happy to be here with you. Recently, I did a short presentation called Why Roswell Matters. It was an exploration of how the Roswell crash of 1947 left a damaging mark on American society, even American democratic institutions, on how Roswell played an important role in furthering the development of what we might call a black budget culture, black budget society. And it's something that's all too often overlooked when we talk about Roswell. Now I want to take you back to the event itself, and I want to show you as much as I can in a relatively short video of what happened during the Roswell event and its aftermath. Now I say short, this is actually going to be a little bit longer than some of my other live streams. Maybe most of those are usually like 20 minutes. This might be 35, maybe 40 minutes. I'm doing this video as part of a series that I thought would be fun to do, which is to follow the cases discussed in the TV series Project Blue Book. And that show covers, on the History Channel, it covers UFO cases with a mixture of fact and dramatic fiction. And what I want to do here is to cover those cases as strictly factually as I can. Since that series opened their season 2 with 2 episodes on Roswell, that's what I'm doing here. Now, of course, Roswell has been subject to much more detailed analysis in many places. Many books, many long documentaries have been devoted to Roswell. And there are people, like when I talked about Roswell the last time, there were people like, oh no, not Roswell again. And that makes me laugh. And I get that a little bit. I mean, in the sense, when you think of the UFO phenomenon in its totality, Roswell is just a sliver of so many interesting things to talk about. So I do understand that. But keep in mind something, that in its totality with the UFO, with the world public, I guess I should say, Roswell occupies a huge amount of space. And some people say, well, it doesn't deserve it. But I would say, look, Roswell is a strong case, and there is a reason why it became so iconic. It's actually a very strong case. There's a lot of witnesses who've talked about what happened there. And I feel like as we move further and further into the 21st century, where it often feels like history itself can be redigitized and subject to Orwellian revision at any time, I think it's very important to continually reassess what happened at Roswell way, way back in 1947. So that's what I want to do here. I think the Roswell case is important. When you hear an overview of it that I'm going to give now, I suspect you will agree, and you may be reminded of a lot of things that you've forgotten or maybe you never even knew. So one thing that's helpful to keep in mind is that in the early summer of 1947, there were a lot of, because that's when the Roswell event happened, there were many things that give us an important backdrop as to what was going on. So one is that the Second World War itself had only recently ended. And it's very easy for us to forget that now, but since the Second World War was 80 years ago, okay? But that war gripped the entire world, and it left millions upon millions dead and millions more homeless at the end of that war. There was tremendous hunger and pain and social upheaval in many parts of the world that also followed in the wake of the Second World War. And it was only 2 years earlier. It ended just 2 years before Roswell. In addition, there was a new global geopolitical rivalry in the form of what was even then being called a Cold War. Not a hot war with guns and bombs and battles, but a cold one, using propaganda, economic measures, political control over foreign governments between the United States and the Soviet Union, that is Russia. And there was certainly a lot of tension on both sides regarding that whole thing. And then there was also a great deal of tension over the fact that humanity had recently developed a new weapon with new scientific principles that unleashed devastating destruction in a way that no previous weapons could ever do. And that, of course, was the atomic bomb. And people began to realize that with enough of those types of weapons, the next big war could actually mark the end of human civilization. So that's a small taste of the world of 1947 when something strange came down in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. But there's even a little more background I want to go over with you And that's the background of UFO sightings themselves. During the war and immediately after the war, there had been sightings by military personnel and by civilians of aerial objects that just did not make any sense to anybody. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but they occurred in the European theater of the Second World War. They occurred in the Pacific theater of the Second World War. And then after the war, they appeared in a variety of places, most notoriously over Scandinavia, but also over a lot of Europe and beyond Europe. The ones over Scandinavia were called ghost rockets. To this day, there has not been a satisfying answer as to what those things were or who was responsible for them. But we do know that they got the attention of many nations, and the United States intelligence community, which was a lot smaller then than it is today, was definitely concerned about these objects. Now then we get to 1947. And there actually were a number of very interesting sightings in the U.S. of inexplicable objects in the sky before Roswell, and even before the Kenneth Arnold sighting of June 24th in the state of Washington. But when you get Arnold's sighting, it was very interesting. What he saw as a private pilot were a number of aerial objects that looked like crescent-shaped craft moving at incredible speeds, over 1,000 miles per hour, which back then was not supposed to be possible. The phrase flying saucer was born. And then it was like a dam had burst. Sightings were being reported everywhere. Some of these sightings were obviously people getting excited about who knows what that they saw, but others were definitely not like that. In fact, one that I think I will cover in the future was a series of sightings over what would later be called Edwards Air Force Base in California. At the time, it was known as Muroc Field. I will come back to that, but it was very interesting, and I still would say inexplicable. The point is that something very odd was going on, and there was no reasonable explanation that anyone could come up with to explain these things. Objects that didn't look normal, that did not behave normally, were being seen and reported by many people. And the tight control over mainstream media that we take for granted today didn't really exist to anywhere nearly that extent in 1947. Back then, there were thousands of independent newspapers everywhere. They were willing to report what was happening. So in that environment, something came down about 75 miles north of the town of Roswell, New Mexico. On Saturday, July 5th, 1947, a sheep herder named Mac Brazel, he was foreman of a ranch called the Foster Ranch. He found crashed debris scattered over a fairly wide area. This was, now, here's the thing. None of us were with Brazel. There are no photos of what actually was there. We're going with statements that he made, which he then had to recant, and which were repeated by other people to newspapers and to friends and so forth. But one thing that he reported or apparently said is that the material seemed unusually lightweight and unusually strong. There was metal, there were plastic-like beams, there was lightweight but strong material, foil, string-like material. I'm not going to say string, I'm going to say string-like material because that's what it seemed like. Brazel told his nearest neighbors, they were named the Proctors, but they apparently were too busy to visit the field at the time, although at some later point, Brazel showed them some fragments, which he said he had tried and failed to cut or burn. So Sunday, July 6th, Brazel brings some of this debris to the sheriff of Roswell, a man named George Wilcox. Wilcox sends 2 deputies to investigate. They never make it. Keep in mind that this place is remote. Undoubtedly, they didn't have perfect directions. The terrain out there was definitely not hospitable to most 4-wheeled vehicles. I know this myself. I went out to the debris field on one occasion. It is remote. It is not even now. It's not easy to drive out there. Had to be way, way tougher in 1947. They did apparently report back that they found an area that looked burned and that where the desert sand was glass-like. If that's true, that's very interesting, and it's indicative of very high heat doing something to the terrain. And in fact, I'll get into a little bit later, that was corroborated apparently by one other very important witness, a man named Dr. Lincoln La Paz. I'll get to him. Now, one thing Sheriff Wilcox did was to call the Army, the Roswell Army Airfield. This is very important now. This unit was home to a very, very important group. It was the 509th Bomb Group or Bombardier Group. This was the unit that was responsible for dropping the atomic bombs over Japan to end the Second World War. In 1947, the 509th was the only military unit in the world that had the ability to drop nuclear weapons. If you're looking for a group of soldiers entrusted with an elite task, you found them. They were commanded by Colonel William Blanchard. Blanchard later went on to become Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force and a 4-star general in the 1960s. So whatever happened here in Roswell clearly did not hurt his career. Blanchard sent a team to investigate what happened. This included Captain Jesse Marcel, intelligence officer, and he was accompanied by a counterintelligence officer named Sheridan Cavett and another Master Sergeant Intelligence Corps person named Master Sergeant William Rickett. These three visited Wilcox's office. They spoke with Brazel. They then accompanied Brazel back to the Foster Ranch, where they arrived late at night. Now, apparently, this was all confusing for years because Cavett denied it for years and years. But not only was he there, but so was Rickett at some point, who later gave details of this to researchers like Stanton Friedman and Mark Roediger. But Cavett was really, he would not talk about this for years. It wasn't until 1994 when the U.S. Air Force did their own quick investigation of Roswell to get ahead of the congressional investigation. I'll get to all that. That Cavett spoke to an Air Force Colonel Richard Weaver and said, yeah, I was at the debris field too. Took a long time to get an admission out of this. Anyway, it was confusing to figure this out for a long time. Meanwhile, military police go to Wilcox's office. They collected the wreckage that Brazel had originally left there. So now we get to Monday, July 7th, 1947. This is a big day. So Cavett and Marcel had arrived the night before at the ranch, and they began Monday morning with and going over the debris field. Before I get to that, I just want to mention that this same day, July 7th, was the day that General Nathan Twining, who was head of Air Material Command and a 3-star general at the time, he later became a 4-star general, he flies to New Mexico. He goes to the Alamogordo Army Airfield, where he made the side trip to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. So he's close by. He stays in the area for 4 days. And, the whole Twining connection is very interesting. And actually, that was covered in the TV show. They brought the Harding, who's the Twining character, basically, who's there. And it's been long debated, like, was Twining there for the Roswell crash, or was he there for something else? Now, it is true that Twining's trip to that area had been made as early as June in the calendar. This was a base, a bomb commander's course at Sandia Base in Albuquerque that happened from July 8th to July 11th. There were visitor logs. There's calendars that indicate that this group, along with Twining, took the course. But the thing is that Twining was also scheduled to take a trip to Boeing at this time, which he had to cancel. And then there was a letter a couple of weeks later in July to a Boeing executive where he refers to a, quote, very important and sudden matter that developed here that prevented him from going to Boeing. Now, what was that matter? Some people say it was the conference itself, which hadn't fully been cleared for Twining until July 3rd. So maybe that's what it was. But it's definitely true. I would say definitely likely that the Roswell crash probably received his immediate attention. He's right there in the area. And one other thing I just want to mention about the Twining visit. So Twining is in the Roswell area at this time. There was another general named Carl Spaatz, who was commander of the Army Air Forces at the time. He was vacationing in the state of Washington at the time. Now, you got to wonder how much of a vacation this would have been. New York Times actually wrote back then that there were a crew of P-51 Mustangs of the Oregon National Guard flying over the Cascade Mountains on an airborne alert. They were searching for the flying saucers that everyone was talking about. Spatz was interviewed in the newspaper about this at the time. He says, I don't know anything about these saucers or any of the searches, the plans to search for them. Well, whether by coincidence or by design, you got two of the nation's most important Air Force generals just happening to be in the nation's two leading UFO hotspots. Let me go back to the Roswell debris field, though. So we're on July 7th, 1947. Many years later, Jesse Marcel told his story to UFO researcher Stanton Friedman. And what Marcel said is that Brazel took him and Cavett to the debris field, which was about 3/4 of a mile long and about 200 or 300 feet wide. There was a gouge in the ground, which he said was about 500 feet long. Okay, so just keep in mind when we get to the balloon explanation, if a balloon could cause this type of gouge and this type of debris, and I think the answer is clearly no. But anyway, what he noticed was debris as thin as newsprint, but which was incredibly strong. And now that's important and interesting itself. Later, another soldier told Marcel that the debris could not be dented, not even by a sledgehammer. There was also foil, which you could crumple and would return to its original shape without any wrinkles. That was interesting. Jesse Marcel also noticed I-beams with odd symbols on them. The beams could flex very slightly, but you couldn't break them. So all these years later, Marcel's telling Friedman, he said, this debris was definitely not a weather or tracking device. It wasn't any sort of plane or missile. And this is a direct quote from Jesse Marcel. It was something I had never seen before or since. It certainly wasn't anything built by us, he said. So that's Marcel. So that whole day, July 7th, Marcel and Cavett are collecting all the debris at Brazel's ranch. According to many accounts, Rickett, the third person in the group, came by with Cavett at some point. So those two fill Cavett's vehicle. Marcel says to Cavett, go on ahead. I'll meet you back at the Roswell base when I get back there. He fills his vehicle, and then late at night, this is Monday, July 7th, he starts his drive back to the base. On his way, he makes a stop at his house. At this point, it's 2 a.m. Wakes up his wife and his son, Jesse Jr., who's 11 years old, shows them the debris. He says this is part of a flying saucer. And of course, Jesse Marcel Jr. remembered that incident for the rest of his life and talked quite a lot about it. Marcel and Cavett we're at the morning, Tuesday, July 8th. They go to Roswell Army Airfield Base that morning. They've got 2 carloads of debris. Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, notifies the 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. It's not that far from Roswell. And he says to Jesse Marcel, you're going to go there with this debris. You're going to meet with General Roger Ramey. So at this point, as far as we can tell, Marcel and Blanchard both believed that they had gotten pieces of these mysterious flying discs. At around noon that day, Blanchard says to his public information officer, Lieutenant Walter Hout, he says, I want you to give out a press release stating this fact. And Hout goes to a man named Frank Joyce at radio station KGFL. And they send it to Western Union. They send it to radio stations. They send it out to newspapers. Reaches the Associated Press wire, 2:26 in the afternoon. And at that point, all hell breaks loose throughout Roswell. And I can assume all hell broke loose up the military chain of command. The Roswell Daily Record reported this story that evening. It was an evening paper. Carried 3 stories about the crash, all of them on the front page. Main statement, the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Airfield announced at noon today that the field has come into possession of a flying saucer. Wow. Wow. So Roswell is overwhelmed immediately with media requests from all over the world. And just as immediately, There was a decision made from way up high to kill that story. 3 hours after the announcement, Jesse Marcel is now in Fort Worth, Texas, with the head of the 8th Air Force, that's General Roger Ramey. Marcel's got the debris in Ramey's office, or at least some of it. According to Marcel, those two men left the office and then came back. And Marcel swore, he said, this time the debris was different. It had been changed. In place of the debris was a ripped apart weather balloon scattered on the floor. Now, the Air Force says that's nonsense. This is the actual debris. So you're left really with Marcel's word on the matter versus that of the Air Force. I'm going to take Jesse Marcel's word on this one. And by the time I'm finished with this, you'll probably do the same. But meanwhile, Ramey brings in the Associated Press. So he's got the whole thing organized for the media. And the AP breaks the story just, again, 3 hours after the original press release at Roswell, that this flying disc was nothing more than a weather balloon. A lot of people forget Ramey also appeared on local radio station in Fort Worth, Dallas. And he just said, yeah, look, Marcel and the folks over at Roswell just had been fooled by a weather balloon. And, you know, they made poor Jesse Marcel pose with scraps of this dilapidated weather balloon. You have to really feel for Jesse Marcel at this point. Like, he just had to take the fall. Ramey tells the press, just a big misunderstanding, no flying saucer, just a weather balloon. Sorry, everyone, for the confusion. Interesting. By the way, now at the same time, there was a very interesting memo from the FBI, and a lot of people have talked about this too, and I want to just discuss it a little bit. An FBI memo dated at that time offered a description of this object and added a couple of interesting details. And I don't really have visuals here for you. By the way, please understand, I do all of this with no production support. So sometimes I can bring in visuals. Sometimes it's hard for me to do that. So here I'm just talking to you about this. I hope you understand. But the FBI memo just said the disc is hexagonal in shape and was suspended from a balloon by cable, which balloon was approximately 20 feet in diameter. The memo goes on. It says, further advised that the object found resembles a high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector, but that telephonic conversation between their office and Wright Field had not borne out this belief. That's interesting. Disc and balloon being transported to Wright Field by special plane for examination. So a lot of people have looked at this memo and said, aha, so clearly not a flying saucer. What a lot of people fail to recognize is that this description in the FBI memo completely follows the description given by Roger Ramey himself to the press, as well as to a Major Curtin, and that's who's the author of this report, to the Reuters wire service. In other words, they just gave this information to the Reuters service. That's it. It appears that the technicians at Wright Field were very skeptical of this claim that a balloon was what had crashed. The debris that was photographed in Ramey's office certainly appeared to be a badly torn up part of a balloon. How Ramey could describe it as hexagonal defies any logic or common sense that anyone could imagine. And of course, just how Marcel, Blanchard, and the rest of the people of the 509th could identify this as a flying saucer is an even greater leap of logic, especially there's no disc ever photographed in Ramey's office. An important aspect of that memo is that it said the debris was, quote, being transported to Wright Field by special plane for examination. So somehow this torn up balloon was considered important enough for serious analysis by the technicians there. Now, why would a down balloon warrant such a treatment? So, I mean, I think what's glaringly obvious in all of that is that Ramey released a cover story about what had crashed, and some of that information got into the FBI memo. I think it's that simple. So by the next day, July 9th, newspapers are reporting, like the New York Times and all the others, that the Roswell disc was just a weather balloon. And that was that. Mac Brazel was under military guard for several days. All right. had meanwhile been led back into town under military escort. And now, contrary to his initial claim, he's now telling reporters that he found the wreckage on June 14th, way earlier. Although he did continue to maintain that it wasn't a weather balloon, so they didn't break him entirely. Meanwhile, there's a poll among Roswell residents that indicated most of them thought that, well, we got experimental military tests that were responsible for these saucer sightings. A couple blamed mass hysteria, and most of the rest just said some kind of natural phenomena. And I wrote about this over 20 years ago in my first book, and my statement at the time was the Army baked it, the press served it, the public ate it. I still think that applies today. So that was basically the public end of the Roswell event for more than 30 years. It was buried so deep that it was forgotten until the late 1970s. And then in 1978, purely by chance, Stanton Friedman meets Jesse Marcel, who had retired as a major by then, living near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And that began the resurrection of Roswell into the, well, iconic case that it's now become. Through the 1980s, through the 90s, and even into the 21st century, researchers like Stanton Friedman, William Moore, Donald Schmitt, Kevin Randall, Tom Carey, and many others interviewed hundreds of people connected to the case. I'm just going to go over a couple of accounts from some of those witnesses that I find interesting myself. One is Bill Rickett. Now, Rickett wasn't only at the crash scene with Cavett and Marcel, but he later told researchers that he escorted Dr. Lincoln La Paz on a tour of the crash site and that the surrounding area. Lincoln La Paz, I've talked about him on this program before, written about him. He was a world-renowned meteor expert. He was with the New Mexico Institute of Meteoritics and was assigned or asked by the military, apparently, to examine the area. Rickett was with him. And according to Rickett, La Paz was to find out what was the speed and trajectory of whatever this thing was. La Paz flew over the area. He found a spot where he said the sand had been turned glass-like, just like the deputies of Wilcox had stated. And La Paz apparently believed that this was caused by a landing and takeoff. La Paz was clearly a believer in the ET explanation of UFOs. A lot of his career points to this. La Paz also apparently talked to a number of local witnesses, and he decided that there had been several objects that came down at Roswell. Another interesting witness is General Arthur Xyn. In Xyn's later years, he was an Air Force brigadier general. In 1947, he was a junior officer at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, when on around July 9th or sometime nearby July 9th, 1947, pieces from Roswell arrived. Now, Xyn never said he saw alien bodies, but he did say he heard rumors about alien bodies at the time. That's interesting. Xyn did not say he participated in analyzing the material that arrived either, but he did claim that he had friends who did and who told him about it. And they said the material was, quote, extraordinary. Xyn did later fly over the Roswell site, and he claimed to have seen the gouges, obvious gouges in the terrain, and tire tracks over two distinctive sites, not one but two. That's interesting. Then you got the testimony of Bill Brazel, who was the son of Mac Brazel. Now, Mac Brazel died before the Roswell case was discussed in the late 70s and 80s. But Bill Brazel was around, and he offered his own account. So in 1947, he was living in Albuquerque, but he came back to the ranch when his father was taken into custody. So he was there. According to Bill and other witnesses, Mac Brazel's time in custody lasted about a week. And during that time, he was seen on the streets of Roswell with a military escort. You got to ask yourself why. Afterwards, Mac Brazel repudiated his initial story to the press, but Bill Brazel's, his son's description of the crash wreckage was the same as Jesse Marcel's. He said that there were various types of debris, including something similar to balsa wood, but it wasn't balsa wood because you couldn't break it. You couldn't whittle it with a knife even. There was another type of debris Bill Brazel talked about that looked like heavy gauge fishing line, but this could not break. And then there was another type of material similar to tin foil or lead foil, except the foil would unfold and straighten out after you crumple it up. And Bill Brazel also said that sometime after the crash, he discussed the foil with some friends in a bar in the town of Corona, New Mexico. And then in his words, he says, lo and behold, here comes the military out to the ranch a day or two later. They said they'd learned of his possession of some bits and pieces of debris. They wanted him to give them back. They said, look, you know, your father had turned everything over that he found. We expect you to do the same. And Bill Brazel gave up the pieces. And then they said, we would rather you not talk very much about this. Why? Then there's the story of Glenn Dennis. Glenn Dennis was a mortician in Roswell in 1947. His employer provided mortuary services for Roswell Army Airfield. Dennis said in early July, didn't give the date, he remembered getting several phone calls from the Roswell Army Airfield mortuary officer, who is more of an administrator than a mortuary technician. And this officer just wanted to know about chemical solutions and hermetically sealed caskets, including how small can you make these caskets. Then there's Barbara Duggar. Barbara Duggar was the granddaughter of Roswell Sheriff George Wilcox. And Barbara Duggar claimed that her grandmother, that's Wilcox's wife named Inez, said that after the incident, military police told the Wilcox couple that the entire family would be killed if they ever talked about this. Inez, as Wilcox's wife, said that George Wilcox had gone out to the site, saw a big burned area, saw debris, and 4 space beings, this is her words, with large heads and suits, she said, like silk, whatever that means. One of the beings was alive. And, you know, Barbara Duggar is talking about her grandmother. She said, look, if she said it happened, it happened. Then there's Frank Joyce. Frank Joyce was over at the Roswell radio station. He claimed that during the whole frenzy of activity in town, the station received a phone call from someone who said he was an officer at the Pentagon. And what Joyce relayed is that he said, this man said some very bad things about what would happen to me. He was really pretty nasty. Finally, he said, I got through to him. I said, oh, you're talking about a release from the U.S. Army Air Corps. And according to Frank Joyce, bang, the phone went dead and he was just gone. Then that evening, Joyce gets a phone call from Mac Brazel, who said the station had not gotten his story right. Joyce is like, really? He says to Brazel, come back to the station. And now Brazel says that this was a debris from a weather balloon. And Joyce said to him, he said, whoa, this is very different from your earlier claim about the little green men. And according to Frank Joyce, Brazel then said, no, they weren't green. And that's basically it for Joyce, except Joyce did say that he really felt Brazel was under tremendous pressure. There's a lot of other witnesses who talked about, for example, the transport of the debris to Fort Worth. One of them was a staff sergeant named Robert Slusher. He just said he was on board a B-29 that carried a single crate from Roswell to Fort Worth. He said the crate was about 12 feet long, 5 feet wide, 4 feet high. He didn't know officially what was in that, but that the contents seemed to be sensitive to air pressure. And the reason he believed that is that the plane flew at a very low altitude, about 4,000 to 5,000 feet. I mean, the standard for a B-29 is 25,000 feet. Now, the crate was put in the bomb bay, which could not be pressurized like the cabin. And that would this suggests that the crate was carrying something other than metal, maybe bodies, right? Slusher also believed that the flight was unusual because he said it was a very hurried flight. It was ordered with very little advance notice. And he also had heard the rumors that the crate had debris from the Roswell crash. That's his whole story. Well, okay, so there's that. And then the last bit of testimony that I just want to discuss here was from 1991, and this was from General Thomas Dubose. Now, in 1947, Thomas Dubose was a colonel, and he had been General Roger Ramey's chief of staff. In the pictures with Jesse Marcel and Ramey, there's pictures also of Colonel Dubose in there as well at times. Dubose was very much involved in all of this. And in 1991, he was interviewed. This is after the Roswell story was already out a bit. There had been some books out. And Dubose very explicitly says, yes, the whole balloon part of it was a cover story. It was a story to be given to the press. And he made it very, very clear that the entire Roswell situation was being managed by a general named Clements McMullen, who was Deputy Chief of Staff of Strategic Air Command at the Pentagon. McMullen ran the whole thing. Dubose, he's very crusty in this interview. His voice is old and gravelly, and he's like, McMullen was a busybody. He wanted to know everything that was going on at Roswell, including who was pissing on the sidewalk. This is one of the things he said. But what he said was McMullen's directive was crystal clear, which he said, this is more than top secret. This is the highest priority, and you will say nothing. More than top secret, highest priority. Now, this isn't even close to an exhaustive list of witnesses and testimony about Roswell, but you get the idea. And you also get the idea that by the 1990s, the U.S. Air Force was really in danger of losing control of the whole Roswell narrative. For instance, during the early 90s, a New Mexico congressman named Stephen Schiff started to look into the case. He'd gotten requests from constituents and some UFO researchers who lived in the area, and they made a good case, and Schiff's like, you know what? Why not look into this? So Schiff thinks this is pretty normal. I'm going to go talk to the Pentagon. Well, the Pentagon gave him nothing but rebuffs and stonewalled him. So Schiff's like, you know what? I'm going to go to the official investigative arm of Congress, because I'm a member of Congress, and this is called the General Accounting Office, the GAO. And the GAO said, yeah, we'll look into this for you. We're going to look into what happened at Roswell in 1947. Wow. Amazing. However, too bad for the GAO. They got nowhere as well. And one Pentagon liaison actually said to the GAO representative, go shit in your hat. Like, we're not going to cooperate with you at all. You have no business getting involved in this. So the GAO did finally finish its report in July of 1995, and that it's an interesting report. It really gets lost in the shuffle when people talk about Roswell, but it's worth stating here. The GAO report was incredibly, all the records, all the administrative records of Roswell Army Airfield from March of 1945 through December of 49 were inexplicably destroyed. Not only that, all of the outgoing messages from the base from October 1946 through December of 1949 which were all permanent records. They should never have been destroyed. These also were destroyed. Okay. The report made this very, very crystal clear that our search of these records was complicated by the fact that some records we wanted to review were missing, and there was not always an explanation. And Schiff was even more direct about this. He said, look, documents that should have provided more information were destroyed. The military cannot explain who destroyed them or why. And there was never any explanation or follow-up that ever happened on this. These were messages that would have shown us how the military officials in Roswell explained what happened to their superiors. Like, these are the outgoing messages. This is where we should have been able to read it, but they were all destroyed. So the investigation of Roswell, this is a perfect example of how the formal government apparatus, in this case Congress, was completely unable to deal with the true center of power. And that's the clandestine, secret keepers of the national security state. Meanwhile, this was a real bit of genius by the U.S. Air Force. The U.S. Air Force had taken the initiative before the GAO even got really going, the U.S. Air Force generated its own report, and they got it out in the summer of '94, a whole year earlier than the GAO. And of course, they did another one in '97. And they said, look, all this confusion was caused by a top secret high altitude balloon. So yeah, we did lie, but it was a balloon, and we had to lie for national security. You know, as I often remember, this was, I think it was a quote from Alan Dulles. Best way to keep a secret is to pretend to share it. This is exactly what the Air Force did here. They said, yeah, there's a project known as Project Mogul. The whole point of this was to send high altitude balloons up with sonar equipment to detect when the Russians or the Soviets detonated their own atomic weapon. Now, it's true, Mogul was a real project. It was top secret, although none of the technology in it was exotic or top secret. But that's what they said this was. And then 3 years later, after people said, hey, you didn't explain any claims of bodies, the Air Force did their explanation of the dummy drops that they said they did, which was in the 1950s. But they thought, well, people just got confused over time and thought that they saw alien bodies in the 1940s. Like, I mean, the most insultingly stupid explanation that you can imagine. But look, when you have to reach for something, you just throw stuff on the wall and see what sticks. And I think they were just hoping that this would stick. Now, nitpicking the Air Force explanations is like shooting fish in a barrel. And you could almost call it a hobby among some UFO researchers. I did my own critique of the Air Force's explanation in my very first volume of UFOs in the National Security State. And I'm not going to go over the whole thing here, but I just will point out a couple of real problems. All right. In neither of the Air Force reports did they make any attempt to interview the still living witnesses from 1947. So none of that happened. Also, the Air Force ignored its own experts. One of them was a lieutenant colonel named Raymond Madsen, who was a project officer on what was called Project High Dive. Madsen told the Associated Press that there was no way that the dummies could be confused with aliens. And each dummy had a reward notice on it. They were stamped as property of the U.S. Air Force. They were all also 6 feet tall and weighed, I think, 180 pounds. Who's going to mistake that for alien bodies? The Air Force ignored the fact that there were no dummies that ever fell near the Roswell crash site anyway. None of them. Also, the dummy tests were known to the public through extensive Air Force publicity at the time. So they kind of leave that out. Then you've got the description of the Mogul's apparatus. All right. So what was this Mogul terrain? In no way, shape, or form does this match with the description of Roswell wreckage by the people who say they were there. Can you really consider glue-treated balsa wood sticks to be as tough and as durable as how people were describing the Roswell wreckage? I mean, are we supposed to believe Marcel, Brazel, Blanchard, Wilcox, and all these others could not identify rubber, tinfoil, or balsa wood debris? Seriously. And then you got the fact that a Mogul balloon was not even nearly large enough or heavy enough to have caused the kind of widespread remains and gouges into the ground that witnesses said were at Roswell. And then you have to ask yourself, neither of the Air Force reports tried to answer why the Army incarcerated Mac Brazel, why they interrogated him for a week, why they held him incommunicado for an entire week. I mean, Brazel's detention by the military was corroborated by his family, by his friends, by neighbors, by Wilcox's family and others. I don't think you can just say it didn't happen. And then finally, I just want to say other launches by Project Mogul, none of them exhibited the kind of security that the Roswell witnesses said happened for the Roswell crash. So, for example, there was a Mogul flight number 7, which was launched just on July 2nd, 1947. And that is known to have crashed off course. Before the balloon train could be recovered, some of the balloons were stolen by civilians. But in this case, there was no military squad sent to round up the thieves. The balloon train actually had identifying information on it and had information to call in the case that it was recovered. Not a big deal. The project was top secret, but not the technology. You could just go on and on with this. Now, what's interesting is that even though so few people to this day actually believe the Air Force's dumb explanation of Roswell, the official word is still promoted by our establishment guardians of truth and is still promoted by the national security state nannies who are happy to tell you what to think. The, as they like to say these days, the authoritative sources. The establishment narrative of balloons, it's this weird thing. Like, it's crumbling on one hand because, frankly, no one believes it. It's this tired piece of official propaganda that has totally ossified over the years. It's this stale piece of disinformation that everyone knows is fake, but no official military or government source admits is fake. And so here we are in 2020. We have to make the Roswell case again and again, like howling into the wind. But the evidence that Roswell was something extraordinary is very strong. And the evidence that it was extraterrestrial in origin, in my view anyway, remains the best of the competing theories. Being lied to by your government always stinks. And it's probably never going to stop. It certainly won't stop until we make a habit of calling out the lies. And we really should be doing this calmly and with the facts every time. I think it's way better to be calm and dispassionate than angry and emotional all the time. Emotions are fine at times and they're appropriate, but I think we're a lot more effective when we just calmly oppose the propaganda with factual reality. I think the Roswell case remains a really important case. I think it's rightly considered one of the key starting points for any new person to want to understand, like, what's the big deal about UFOs? With Roswell, you have something that objectively happened. We know it happened because it was reported and then was buried for 30 years. And then by the time it came back out, there were enough people still living or closely connected to the original witnesses that a very strong case was made by a variety of researchers. Yes, there are lots of debates between and among the researchers. There are debates by them over the validity of certain witnesses. Some seem more legit than others, and I think that's right. But when you look at the sum total of the case, you've got a very strong one that something came down. Now, there are, again, competing theories, extraterrestrial or some kind of testing of German tech or even Japanese tech was one theory. But I think that when you look at the sum total of the amount of evidence, something that we did not make is the strongest, makes the strongest case. And in connection with all of the other aspects of the UFO phenomenon now, particularly the recent admissions of the United States Navy that there are genuine UFOs or UAP, like they've admitted it. And no one seems to have an explanation as to who's making these or how these things can exist. I think, officially speaking, the door has now again been opened to recognizing the legitimacy of the UFO phenomenon as something beyond our civilization. And if you recognize that, then looking at Roswell as something beyond our civilization is really not that much of a stretch, it seems to me. Anyway, that's all I've got for you on Roswell. There's so much more to dig into, but I hope this has been interesting for you. I want to thank you for joining me today. If you like what you see here, please like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. That always helps me. You can also visit my websites, which are Richard Dolan Press and richarddolanmembers.com. Got a lot going on in both of those, particularly Richard Dolan Members. Again, thanks for staying with me here today. Catch you next time. Later.